Hi everyone, this is Andrew Quintana, host of Forum Beyond the Pages. Before we get started with this week's episode, I wanted to take a moment to talk about an important opportunity. For those who don't know, Florida Humanities is the statewide nonprofit affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. For more than 50 years, our organization has worked tirelessly to amplify and promote Florida's rich history and heritage. Over the last 5 decades, how we approach that mission has looked a little different, but one thing remains the same: our passion for telling all of Florida's stories. Whether it's through our award-winning magazine Forum or our grant making that supports vital humanities programming for libraries, museums, and cultural organizations, Florida Humanities has always championed giving every Floridian a platform to tell our collective story. However, that work is currently under threat. Recent cuts to NEH have dealt a considerable blow to our efforts, leaving a $1.7 million funding gap that we are working to fill. Our story is not over, though. Thanks to the generosity of philanthropist Hugh Culverhouse Jr. and the Mellon Foundation, we have been given a matching gift opportunity that can help us continue to support humanities programming in every Florida county, and we need your help to reach our goal. Your support can help us continue telling the Florida story because there is still so much to be written. To learn more about how you can support us, visit our website at floridahumanities.org/SaveFH. Now, on with the show. Welcome to Forum Beyond the Pages, the podcast that tells the stories behind the stories of Florida Humanities award-winning magazine. I'm Andrew Quintana. We're celebrating some of the Sunshine State's greatest artists and entertainers this season as we speak to the writers featured in our spring 2025 issue of Forum. This week, historian Jim Clark on his story, Close Encounters of the Presidential Kind. Florida may not be the oldest state in our nation's history, but it has certainly had a presence in some of the most pivotal moments, especially when it comes to those moments involving presidents of the United States. Not every U.S. president visited Florida, but almost all have had to interact with the state. Some during wartime, others during election season, and many in need of a vacation. In his story for Forum, historian Jim Clark looks back at how U.S. presidents have visited, inspired, battled, and shaped the Sunshine State. Have you heard of the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon?
Oh, sure.
I feel like this story is the Florida equivalent of that. The state seems to always have a brush with national attention in every era, it seems like, of the country's history. Were you aware just how well connected Florida was to presidential history when you first started this story?
No, I came on it quite by accident while I was working on my doctorate at the University of Florida. Doing some research into Florida politics in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and stumbled across Senator Claude Pepper, who probably was one of the most famous U.S. senators from Florida, but who ran against Harry Truman in 1948 for one day for the Democratic nomination. And that got me kind of interested in how many other people ran. And I found that Florida has always been kind of flirting with the White House.
Before we get into some of those presidential connections, what seems to be the common thread with Florida and its run-in with past presidents?
Failure, I think, is probably the characteristic. We've had about a dozen Floridians, office holders, run for president and fail every time. And it wasn't until last year that we finally got a winning candidate.
The earliest encounter I found in your story with the president actually occurred during a time when the state wasn't so united. Florida is no stranger to being at the center of election results, but its first real test state was during the Civil War, it turned out. Can you tell me about that story?
Yeah, at the beginning of 1864, Abe Lincoln was worried that he would lose the presidency. And he began, as all candidates do, counting electoral votes. Where could he win? What could he carry and what did he need? And his eye fell on Florida. It only had 3 electoral votes at the time, but that might have been enough to put him over the top. So he came up with a bizarre plan to get Florida back in the Union. And this was the only time Abraham Lincoln ever conducted a military exercise without consulting really his generals. He ordered troops to Florida, to Jacksonville, and it led to the Battle of Olustee, which the Union lost badly, and ended his idea of bringing Florida back into the Union before the end of the Civil War.
So his mindset was basically to recapture Florida in order to win the election?
Yes, he wanted those 3 electoral votes. He thought that Florida would be an easy pushover because it had very few troops, really. And nobody was expecting an invasion of Florida. But after he landed at the troops at Jacksonville and they began marching overland, by the time they got around Live Oak, the Confederates were there waiting, and they had pulled troops not only from Florida, but also from Georgia, and they destroyed the Union Army that day.
Obviously, he failed in his attempt to recapture Florida during the Civil War. So did he end up even needing the state to win the election?
Not at all. By November, the Civil War was going better. The North had posted some significant victories, and people were feeling better about it, and he won fairly easily.
Fast forward nearly a whole century later, and Florida is the scene of a very touching moment, actually, in presidential history. The poet Robert Frost and the president-elect at the time, John F. Kennedy, were both living in South Florida before the 1960 inauguration. How did the two men find themselves in the Sunshine State, and how did their paths end up crossing at a historic moment?
The Kennedy family had purchased an estate at Palm Beach. They bought it from the Wanamaker family, the department store owners in Philadelphia. And Joe Kennedy liked to come down sometimes with his girlfriends and sometimes with his families. So John Kennedy had an introduction to Florida beginning in the 1930s. And he came here after World War II several times to recuperate from surgery. Robert Frost, of course, had the connection with the Kennedys in New England, both from New England. We don't think of them as Floridians. But Frost had become here in the 1930s. For a time, he lived in Key West. He thought about settling in Gainesville and ended up in Cape Coral. And Kennedy invited him to read a poem. The original idea was that he would write something for the inauguration. But Frost said no, he wanted to read one of his poems for the inauguration. And Kennedy said, fine. But then at the last minute, he decided to write a poem, but didn't tell anybody. And so on the day of the inauguration, the weather was simply miserable and the wind was blowing. And when he began to read his poem, the wind blew it so badly he couldn't finish it. And so he stopped in the middle and then recited the poem he had rejected earlier. So it was very awkward, but I'm not sure in that horrible weather that many people noticed it.
Watergate, Vietnam. That's not me trying to set the scene for the next part of your story, but that's usually what comes to mind when we think of Richard Nixon. However, in your story, you think Floridians should only use 2 words when they talk about Nixon, which is thank you. Why is that?
You're absolutely right. He turned out to be the best friend the Florida environment has ever had. And I think that surprises a lot of people. Nixon first came to the state in 1950. He won the Senate seat in California, came back to Washington for a special session as a House member still. And the weather in Washington was miserable. And as you know, he loved the sunshine. And he ran into Florida Senator George Smathers and said, George, I hate this weather. I'd love to get some sunshine. And Smathers said, well, why don't you go to California, your state? And he said, listen, it takes so long to fly there. And when I get there, everybody wants me to make a speech. Smathers said, listen, why don't you go to Florida? We have these new direct flights. on national airlines. You can be there in a few hours. I'll fix you up with a friend of mine, and you can relax and get some sun. And that was his introduction to a love affair with Florida that would last a quarter of a century. Florida has always had people who believe that draining the Everglades is a grand idea, and building a cross-Florida barge canal is an even better idea. And this goes back really to 1600s. These ideas were first hatched. And both, of course, would have been terrible. When Nixon became president, the construction on the cross-Florida barge canal was ongoing. Lyndon Johnson had restarted it with a symbolic dynamite blast. Nixon listened to some environmentalists in Florida, mainly Nat Reed, and he killed the cross-Florida barge canal, which really angered a lot of big Republicans and a lot of big special interests in Florida. At the same time, the city of Miami was thinking of building a huge airport and city. It was going to be a city out in the Everglades. And he also killed that project. Those would have damaged Florida's environment seriously, and Nixon saved Florida's environment, something so few people realize.
Obviously, presidents govern all 50 states of this country and make decisions that impact people in every single one. However, Florida continues to stand out in almost every administration, it seems like.
Yeah, I think so many presidents have had a vested or personal interest in Florida. I mentioned Richard Nixon, who loved to come here and came here as often as he could. George Bush, the first and the second, both at times had homes here. They loved to fish here. The first George Bush had his own fishing tournament here. You go back, Herbert Hoover loved to fish here and belonged to a club in the Everglades. Warren G. Harding, his father-in-law owned a home in Daytona Beach, and he came here a lot. So many presidents had ties to Florida, either before they became president or while they were president. So, for example, Herbert Hoover is a great example of somebody who loved Florida, loved to come here fishing, and saw the damage flooding could do. And he was the one who initiated efforts to prevent flooding in Lake Okeechobee, building the Herbert Hoover Dike, which is still there today.
That was Jim Clark on his story, Close Encounters of the Presidential Kind. Forum Beyond the Pages is produced by Florida Humanities. Our music was created by Tampa Bay musician JJ Padishal. You can follow him on Instagram at JJ Padishal Music. To read the digital edition of Forum, visit floridahumanities.online. Want to get the latest issue of Forum magazine delivered to your door 3 times a year? Become a Florida Humanities member by visiting floridahumanities.org/membership. Until next time.